Great. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's been more than 10 years since I was in Dublin, so I'm delighted to come back, and especially to be part of such an excellent event. I'm a biologist as well, just like Emma, and you will see that a lot of what I have to say bears a lot of similarity to what Emma just told you. But there will be some differences of emphasis, and you will see why those lead to different approaches and different things that we pursue in our respective research. I hope I'm going to be able to convince you that actually we do have a respectable chance of, in the foreseeable future, getting to the rejuvenation alternative that Emma showed at the bottom of her last slide. And this is really what it would mean, right? That age would no longer mean aging. In other words, that one's health would not be related to how long ago one was born. So I'm going to try to persuade you of that. Of course, we know that life expectancy has gone up over the past couple of hundred years by rather a lot. This is just for illustration, it's US statistics, looking at the population over 65. And this is, of course, a great success story. It's of course a celebration because it has mostly arisen from the fact that we are, very few of us, dying early in life anymore. Even in the wealthiest countries in the world 200 years ago, more than 1/3 of babies would die before the age of 1. And of course, there was lots of death in childbirth and so on. And having eliminated that, of course, the average longevity goes up a great deal. We have seen, since, let's say, World War II, a continuation of that trend. And of course, that has not been because of further declines in the incidence of death early in life, because that can only be done once, and it had already been done by then. Therefore, it has actually been because we have been keeping people healthier at older ages, and thereby keeping them alive longer. Now, however, the rate of increase since World War II has been considerably slower in the Western world than it was in the previous 100 years. So something's got to give, and indeed we are, arguably anyway, reaching the point where we've basically done what we can do by the kinds of means that have achieved that increase. A lot of people think that it was because prosperity has led to better nutrition throughout life, especially prenatal and perinatal nutrition, which essentially stays with you all your life, so that you spend essentially your whole life being biologically younger than your parents would have done. And of course, that's again something that can only be done once. So a number of countries have pretty much leveled off now in terms of their life expectancy trajectory. So what are we going to do next? Well, we've really got to do something pretty soon, because, and I think we'll probably be hearing about this from the next talk a little bit more, the economic consequences of the current situation are really rather terrifying. The problem, of course, is that the health problems of old age tend not to kill you very quickly, whereas, of course, infections, if they kill you at all, they kill you rather fast. And the result is that we've got a huge number of sick people now. So again, this just for illustration, US statistics. The red line is the trajectory over just 50 years, from 1960 through to 2010, of the size of the US economy. And the blue line is the trajectory during that same period of medical expenditure in the USA. Doesn't look particularly scary drawn like that, but it looks terrifying when you divide one by the other, which is what the green line is. And it's gone up in just 50 years from 5% to 18%. So I won't say any more about that, because as I say, we're going to be hearing more about it soon. But what I will do is stand back from the question a bit. Now, my original training was not in biology, actually. I was originally a computer scientist. And that has probably led to a lot of why I look at the problem of aging a bit differently than most people do who have spent their whole careers in biology. In particular, I started asking myself, when I started getting into this, I started asking myself some questions that perhaps are not asked often enough. So the first question is this: why have the health problems of old age been so much more difficult for medicine to overcome than the health problems of early life? And I mean, because the fact is, the reason we don't die of infections anymore, to speak of, early in life, is predominantly because of really, really simple things. Just discovering that hygiene is a good idea, saved a most incredible number of lives. And the simple medicines like vaccines and antibiotics, it's amazing. So what's different about the health problems of old age? Now, most people would say it's this, that, don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. The point here, of course, is that, a hell of a lot of things go wrong with us late in life. And they go wrong at more or less the same time, which means, of course, that they interact and exacerbate each other. So a lot of the answer, surely, is that it's just the complexity that has overwhelmed medical efforts. And that is certainly part of the answer. But I want to argue that it's actually not the most important part of the answer, and this is a different one. So I'm going to start by doing exactly what Emma did and defining aging. And as Emma pointed out, different people have different definitions, which is a bit of a problem in my book. It's pretty crazy as well, since aging has been a preoccupation of humanity for rather a long time, that we can't even decide what it means. Now, I like this definition, which is basically to say that aging is the combination of two processes. There's a left-hand process, which is the creation of this thing I'm going to call damage, and I'm going to come and say what I mean by that shortly. And that goes on throughout life, even starting before we're born, because it is intrinsically a feature of metabolism. In other words, a feature of the processes, the network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next. But the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage without appreciable decline in performance, so basically nothing much happens. I'm 55 years old and I can still run nearly as fast as I could when I was 25, and I can still think nearly as fast. So, that's all great. But then, of course, late in life, stuff goes wrong because the body is only set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage. Eventually, you've got more than that, and that's when things start to go downhill. So you've just heard that some people will define aging, well, essentially Steve Orstad's definition that Emma just gave is pretty much that aging is this right-hand process here, where, not starting before we're born, but starting sometime later, damage starts to cause decline in performance. Other people would say that that aging should be defined as the left-hand arrow, the creation of the damage in the first place. It really doesn't matter what you use the word to mean. What matters is that there are these two processes going on, and they are distinct processes, and thinking about them distinctly has value. So the problem is that we've been trying to go after the health problems of old age with geriatric medicine all this time. Ever since we decided that the things that went wrong with people late in life were things we ought to try to fix with medicine, we've been trying to fix them a bit as if they were infections. We've been attacking these pathologies of old age and trying to cure them, eliminate them from the body in the way that we might eliminate tuberculosis. And, you don't have to look at this diagram for very many milliseconds to realize that that's completely brain dead. Because, you're attacking the consequence of something that is accumulating, namely damage. And therefore, by definition, anything that does that is going to become progressively less effective as the person gets older. It's just obviously not going to work. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out and to realize this. The field of gerontology exists basically because more than a century ago, a few people started to actually notice that this wasn't going to work. And they said, well, okay, we've got to be more preventative. And that's where the field came from. Now, to a large extent, I believe that the field was inspired by just the kind of thing that Emma was talking about. The fact that within the living world, we see a very large variation in the rate of aging, in the rate at which metabolism generates damage in different species. Even within a species, there's a certain amount of variation. So essentially, I think the idea was that we might be able to study this variation and figure out what was going on. And actually, if we understand it really well, then maybe we'll be able to translate that understanding into some kind of intervention that will essentially make metabolism run more cleanly, make it generate damage more slowly than it normally would, which would be great. It would, postpone the point at which the damage reaches the pathogenic level of abundance. Fantastic. A couple of problems with that, though. First of all, you'd better start early if you're going to do that. If you take someone my age and you have some magic intervention, maybe inspired by bats or anything, that, let's say, halves the rate at which damage is accumulating, it's not going to do me much good because I've already got most of the amount of damage that's necessary to make me sick. So you better start early in life. That's a bit of a shame for those of us who are already getting on. That's just one of the problems. The other problem is a rather more fundamental one, I think, which is this. Metabolism is viciously complicated. Hands up anyone here who writes software, even recreationally. Not many of you, okay, just a few, right? Yeah, I mean, anyone who writes software will immediately see that this is the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code, right? Figuring out what's going on here to the extent of being able to tweak it so that it doesn't do the thing we don't want it to do, namely the creation of damage, without having unintended consequences that stop it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive, it's a pretty damn tall order. It's not obvious that we could ever really do that. Because fundamentally, the creation of damage is so intrinsically bound up in the network of processes that we call metabolism. I very much applaud people like Emma for doing research to try to prove me wrong about this. I would love to be wrong, but the fact is, it's not looking too good right now. I mean, we've been trying for quite a long time to essentially do this, and by the 1970s or so, gerontologists had more or less given up. It had become completely unacceptable to even talk about intervention in aging in a grant application, for example. Aging, when I'm feeling flippant, I tend to describe gerontologists of that era as a bit like seismologists. They understand that the thing they're studying is bad for you, but they have no aspiration to doing anything about it. It was a bit unfair, but there you go. Now, there were some forestorms. Certainly, the discovery of genes and then drugs that could trick the body into thinking it was on calorie restriction when it isn't was pretty exciting. But unfortunately, it seems, and again, this was something that Emma briefly referred to, that long-lived species get a lot less benefit from calorie restriction, and therefore they're bound to get a lot less benefit from such drugs as well than short-lived species do. And this is evolutionarily perfectly what you would expect, but unfortunately it also seems to be actually true, which is a great shame. And of course, I'm understating the problem here. This is actually, the problem is not so much that this is this here, it's a simplified diagram, right, of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And it's already scary as hell. But actually, the really scary thing is that it's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which, despite the efforts of a lot of people, is still unquestionably dwarfed by the vast amount that we don't know about how the body works. And that's even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, I'm honestly not optimistic. I'm much more optimistic about a different approach. So, going back to my definition of aging with these three words, essentially what I'm saying is that aging is the combination of these two processes that are linked by this thing called damage. There's the left-hand process where metabolism generates damage, and there's the right-hand process where damage generates pathology late in life. And what I've tried to explain is that it's really not looking too good for breaking that process by breaking either of the two component processes. In other words, the arrows down here. But you can break the overall process, the link between being alive and being dead, without breaking either of the two component processes. And that's what the maintenance approach is. The maintenance approach says, basically, let's actually let metabolism generate damage at the rate that it naturally does so, but then let's step in every so often and repair some of that damage. Just eliminate it from the body so that even though it's being generated, it does not reach this pathogenic level of abundance. That's the fundamental concept. And you may think I'm being a little bit, overly aggressive by calling it the common sense alternative, but I don't think so, because the fact is, it's what we already do. This here is a 100-year-old car, and it's doing just as well as when it was built. And the fundamental thing that I want to draw your attention to is that this car was not designed to last 100 years. This car was probably designed to last 10 years. And the only reason it's still out there doing so well is because its owners fell in love with it and they have done an unusually comprehensive job of preventative maintenance. Periodic, comprehensive preventative maintenance is the way we do this. We ought to be able to do the same thing for a really complicated machine like the human body. Fundamentally what I'm saying is that aging is not some kind of emergent phenomenon like consciousness that only exists in living organisms. Aging is really fundamentally the same thing in a living organism as what it is in a simple man-made machine. The preventative maintenance approach already works. But of course, there's one huge gap in what I've said so far, which is the question of how complicated the damage is. If you see what I've said so far, really I've kind of approached this whole question as an engineer, as a technologist. Technologists are all about manipulating nature, and the way that they do it is by figuring out what they don't need to know in order to develop interventions that work. Whereas basic scientists are all about understanding nature, and the idea of kind of having something you don't need to know is kind of antithetical to the way they often think. Nevertheless, though, here we have a problem. Because what I've said is that by doing this maintenance approach, we are sidestepping our ignorance of the enormous complexity of metabolism, and we're also sidestepping our ignorance of how damage generates pathologies. Because essentially we're not proposing to mess with metabolism, and we're also not proposing to let the damage be abundant enough to cause the pathology. So both of those processes are kind of, we can ignore them. But what we absolutely can't ignore is the damage itself. It could be that the damage is also just as complicated as its causes and its consequences, and thus that even though this is the common sense approach, it's still impractical. We just can't repair the damage comprehensively enough to give the desired result. So I'm going to now argue, I'm going to actually talk biology at last, I'm going to argue that that's not the case. That actually, unlike pathology, this approach actually does make sense. That the key thing is that all of the various types of molecular and cellular change that qualify as damage, by definition I'm using, these consequences of metabolism that accumulate, all of them can be classified into one of these 7 categories that I've listed on the left-hand side here. Now that's very different from what we can do in the case of pathology, where I showed you all that huge list in very small font. Because there, yes, we could do a classification, but the point of this classification is that we can describe a corresponding generic intervention that actually implements the maintenance approach. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit in a second. Whereas in the case of geriatric medicine, you can't do that. Basically, every pathology is different, and there's not much commonality, not much reuse that you can do in moving from one pathology to another. So, for example, cell loss, what's that? It's simply cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells, and the differentiation of those cells, of course. That happens in a number of aspects of aging. Let's take, for example, Parkinson's disease. Turns out that one type of neuron, dopaminergic neurons, because of their function, they die rather more rapidly than other neurons, and they're not replaced. So by old age, all of us have lost maybe a quarter of the dopaminergic neurons that we had early in adulthood. Some people, of course, as with everything in aging, some people lose them a little faster, and they've lost maybe 3/4 of the neurons, and those are the people who get Parkinson's. The obvious fix, of course, is stem cell therapy. You put cells back into the body that have been prepared in the lab to know what to do, to divide and differentiate, to replace the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And this was first done more than 25 years ago, when we didn't really know much about how to ensure that we were injecting the right kind of stem cell. And the result was, of course, that most patients had no benefit. But a few patients just got lucky and got some of the right kind of stem cell, and those patients were completely cured. 25 years later, without any other medication, they were taken off L-DOPA and so on, they're still completely fine. So now that we know a lot more about how to manipulate stem cells and get the right type, half a dozen clinical trials are starting up to do this, and it's looking very hopeful. Now, I'm the chief scientist of a foundation that was set up a decade or more ago to work on all of this. And the reason we had to do that was because the other 6 areas of damage were not being explored nearly so heavily as stem cells were. We reckoned that, well, I reckoned that we would have ways to actually repair all of these types of damage. And we've been pursuing this ever since. But one other really good thing that hasn't happened is the changing of the plan. I put forward this 7-point plan, as you can see, 15, 16 years ago, and I'm still getting away with it. There's no one's coming along and identifying types of damage that don't fit into this classification. And furthermore, no one's come along and identified reasons why the particular approaches that we've been pursuing all this time won't work, and we need another plan. So that's all pretty cool. In fact, it's so good that now it's become a bit of a mainstream, orthodox way of looking at the problem. Just 5 years ago, as you already saw in Emma's talk, a few people from Europe decided to essentially reinvent the exact same idea, and this is now basically a touchstone of the field. This paper's already been cited more than 2,000 times in only 5 years. They split aging into 9 categories instead of 7, but that's not because they identified things that I'd overlooked. It was just, they did a different subdivision. But it's the exact same concept, a divide and conquer damage repair approach. And everybody uses this paper now to kind of justify and legitimize their own work as being part of the universe of things that are worth working on. So that's very nice. I mean, I would obviously like to have got a bit more of the credit, but the main thing is that I don't have to persuade people of this anymore. That this is something that is really happening. So that's nice. I do want to talk about longevity a bit, though, because this is something that comes up a lot. As you've seen from the damage repair concept that I've been describing, this is a rejuvenation idea, where you can actually have that sawtooth kind of thing that Emma showed in her slides. And that means that you can pretty much expect to be able to go on forever in terms of rejuvenating people periodically. The damage that they have in their bodies that you have to repair will become increasingly enriched in damage that's difficult to repair, damage that the therapies don't really work on. But against that, you've got progressive improvements in how good the therapies are in the first place. So you reach this concept that I, a long time ago, named longevity escape velocity, where we are staying one step ahead of the problem of damage accumulation pretty much forever. So we're going to see quite a big increase in longevity, and some, possibly unwisely, some large number of years ago, I pointed this out publicly, and the result is that the media will never leave me alone when it comes to longevity, and they kind of don't want to hear the fact that longevity is just a side effect of health. Let's face it, most people die of being sick. And therefore, if we can stop people from getting sick when they get old, then they're probably going to live a lot longer on average. But I really think it's important to emphasize that it's all about health. And the reason it's important to emphasize it is because of the pro-aging chance that Emma mentioned, that there's this desperate tendency among humanity to put aging out of their minds and get on with their miserably short lives and make the best of it, rather than being preoccupied by this terrible thing. And the fundamental problem is that people don't want to get their hopes up. I think that's just cowardly. But the fact is, I think that that attitude allows us to just not think about whether we will actually, or whether these therapies will come along in time to benefit us. And this is why I feel that there are absolutely no ethical issues around this, because nobody says, there's no argument about whether it would be good to have a cure for Alzheimer's or atherosclerosis or cancers or whatever. So we just have to remember that this is a side effect. And I get all these questions all the time, like where will we put all the people, or won't it be boring, or doesn't death give meaning to life? Bullshit like that. So. And of course there are perfectly good answers to these things, like overpopulation's not going to happen because we're improving renewable energy and artificial meat and so on. That's going to make the carrying capacity of the planet rise really fast anyway. And so I can go through all of these things on the left specifically, but the key thing that matters is the things on the right. The fact that it's all about health. Also the fact that even if by some bizarre anti-miracle we actually did get some of the problems on the left in ways that we couldn't address, would those problems really be worse than the problem we have today? Have a sense of proportion. We are losing 110,000 people every day worldwide from aging. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're losing them after, in most cases, a long period of decline and decrepitude and general misery. So come on. But anyway, just a few minutes about the foundation. So this is just a small selection of the papers that we've published over the past few years. I mentioned these ones because they were real big breakthroughs in terms of unlocking whole areas of research that have been log-jammed for over a decade. Ways to actually do some of these damage repair things that everyone else had decided was just too hard. And a lot of this has gotten now to the point where we've been able to spin projects out into startup companies. which of course is very handy because it allows us to attract money for these projects from people who don't like giving money away. Because some of these people that invest in these companies are very visionary, they're very supportive and all of that, but they really don't like charity. But yeah, this is just one example, a company working on macular degeneration via a method that we pioneered that essentially involved in, incorporating bacterial enzymes into human cells that augment their catabolic capacity, allow them to break down stuff that they naturally would not be able to. And we did the same thing for atherosclerosis, for oxidized cholesterol. This is a company working on amyloidosis in the heart, which turns out to be the #1 killer of centenarians. This is a company working on organ cryopreservation, on actually being able to freeze organs in such a way that when you warm them up, they're still organs. They haven't actually been damaged. That's going to obviously change the organ transplantation landscape rather a lot. This is a company working on a genetic approach to getting rid of senescent cells. And I thought I ought to mention that this industry has exploded. So, like those 4 companies I just mentioned, they're spin-outs from us. We've spun out a couple of others. But over the past literally year or two maximum, we've gone up like an order of magnitude or so in terms of the sheer number of startup companies that are working in this rejuvenation space, this damage repair space. And, you know, I'm struggling to keep up, to be honest. I mean, because I have a reasonably high profile in this field, investors come to me and they ask me for opportunities, and of course everyone else comes to me to get investors, so I'm spending a lot of my time just making introductions, which is great. But the point is the growth of the industry is enormous. And I thought I would just mention Unity, the one at the bottom, because Unity is a company based in the Bay Area, where I live now, that is working on the elimination of senescent cells. It was formed on the basis of some insanely preliminary data from academia, but it's still got perfectly good seed money, like $7 million, I think it was. And a couple of years later, by the beginning of this year, it had raised a total of $300 million. Now, you know, biotech companies that do well, they raise that kind of amount. That's not the surprising thing. But the thing is, they raise it when they've already got, like, a drug through, or at least in phase 3 clinical trials, when it's like one step away from becoming a product. This company raised that money before they'd even begun their first clinical trial. It's just mind-blowing. So, I mean, from an industrial perspective, I don't know if there are any investors in the audience here, but I just think it's important to understand that this industry is going to be by far the biggest industry of all time. It's going to totally dwarf the dot-com boom. And you can see that another way as well. You can look at today's anti-aging industry. Now, today's anti-aging industry is already a multi-billion thing, right? Despite the fact that it's based entirely on products that fundamentally don't work, right? So you can probably work out how big it would be if it were based on something that does work. So as I mentioned, we are a charity and we still exist. We remain the kind of the indispensable engine room of this industry, because there are definitely some projects that are not yet at the level of investability, even by nice, high-risk, high-reward friendly people. And I wrote this book some time ago, more than a decade ago now, actually, about all this, which will tell you everything that I haven't had time to tell you this evening. As I mentioned, there's been massive progress since then, but the progress has been very much what we predicted. We haven't had to change any of the fundamentals, so it's still very relevant and up to date, and I recommend it to you. Thank you very much.